now they're making Ghostbusters with only women. What's going on?
Shut up and sit down.
We will respond with that timeless creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on Earth.
I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
Read my lips.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Ah!
I love the poorly educated. We're the smartest people. We're the most loyal people.
This is awkward. It's gonna be a hard week. You know, obviously my haircut didn't turn out the way that I want, but I think over time we'll be able to get through this as a collective group and as a nation. So thank you guys for being here for this very important moment. I'm making jokes.
I think it looks nice, Nick.
Thanks.
Good
I know.
touch.
Anyways, hi guys, it's Barstool Politics. I'm your host, Nick McGuire, joined as always by Dr. Bill Muck from North Central College and Dr. Phil Barker from Keene State College. And special guest, we have Associate Professor of Theology at Bellarmine University, Dr. Justin Klassen, correct? With us this week? Sorry, okay, man, I'm just screwing up everything with you today.
No, you got it.
Anyways, Justin, thank you for being here. Yeah, I'm gonna forgo pretty much everything we do at the beginning with social and all that fun stuff. You know, share the podcast, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. You can buy some merch that you know, Bill is promoting right now. There's just a tremendous amount of stuff to talk about. This is without a doubt the most bizarre week that we've had in the 4 years of doing this podcast. I'm sure the most bizarre week. We've said that a lot. I hope it doesn't go any farther than this, because I'm not sure what would be beyond this. Yeah, Bill, I mean, you know, try and explain what the hell just happened.
Let's do it. So welcome to Infrastructure Week. Finally, we've hit Infrastructure Week. If life were only that simple. So over the last week, we've watched history unfold before our eyes. Thousands across the country have taken to the streets to protest racism and police violence after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Many of the peaceful protests have been accompanied by looting and the destruction of property. Put together, it has made for a traumatic, horrifying, and at times uplifting week that has left the country teetering on the edge of chaos. We're going to devote the entire episode to the week's developments. We're lucky to be joined by Justin Klassen to help us think through all of these developments. In the first half of the episode, we will take a big picture look at the protests, the looters, and Trump's response to it all. For instance, can and will he invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy the military across the country? And what does all of this mean for the country as a whole? Then in the second half of the episode, we're going to narrow in on Trump's Bible photo op and consider the role of religion in all of this. But to start off, let's offer some initial impressions of the history we were all bearing witness to. Justin, why don't you start us off with some of your own reactions from the week?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me to be here, you guys. It's great. I think that, you know, my initial impression was I didn't know what was going on, and I felt upset about it because I was actually camping as of Thursday, and demonstrations really started then and on the weekend, especially in Louisville. And so I had terrible reception, but I heard people talking. You know, I was trying to stay socially distant, but I overheard things were happening in town. And so I was kind of desperate to get back and find out about it. And my first kind of impression was, especially, I don't know, around the campground, was that it is just still so very hard for people of color to be heard in their anguish in this country. And what I mean by that is like the inclination of a lot of people to go straight for the this logic that says, well, it's very sad that Black people have been killed, but do they have to break windows? That sort of thing. That it's reversed, right? Instead of well, it's sad or it's hard that looting is taking place, but I mean, the main thing is, right, why are Black people being killed at disproportionate rates and in unjust circumstances? And so that was kind of surprising to me. And then, or not surprising, I guess, but disheartening. But then, when I got back and I was kind of picking up with folks around the country and also my family up in Canada, it actually struck me that more people are sensitive to the problems of that argument. And so maybe there are more people on cable news worried about that than there are in real life. And to me, that was a change. I have had actually fewer actual conversations with folks that go, well, I believe, of course, that Black Lives Matter, but, if only they could just listen to Martin Luther King, right? That kind of thing, trotting out Dr. King as an example of someone who was appropriately passive, in this kind of forgetful way that people often do. I feel like there's been less of that. And so to me, this feels actually like a possibly healthy awakening. And there's also the really handy fact that when people object to quote unquote violent, but really it's just disruptive, right? Really disruptive and possibly destructive to property aspects of the protests. It's nice for us now that we can actually go back to like Colin Kaepernick, who really didn't destroy any property, and they didn't want that either, right? And so we can see that really, I mean, people just don't want protests. Some people, right? Some people really just don't want there to be serious questions raised about the status quo. So anyway, those were some of my impressions, but also, of course, Trump. I was in some ways, like, I mean, I'm not surprised, but I'm stunned. I'm continually stunned at his inability even to just, like, there are these opportunities that he has even to just be empathetic. Like, he doesn't have to change any policy. Like, it would cost him nothing, really, with his own base even, to just say, this is real pain, that Black people experience in this country, and it's got a long history. It would be so simple, and he wouldn't have to, throw police or even law and order, his favorite things to support, under the bus. But he just refuses. He just cannot do it. He is constitutionally incapable of recognizing that the status quo that gives him a tremendous amount of benefits could even be worthy of criticism at any point. And so that's been disgusting. And also, like, my kids have, we watched like one cable news show one evening. I think it was Monday night. And of course, they play clips of the president and whatever. And actually that was the night where he did the Bible thing, right? Yeah, Monday night. And so we were seeing, the dispersal of, and then we were also hearing, and we're Episcopal Christians, our family, we go to an Episcopal church. And so we're hearing the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C. respond to that, and seeing, the stuff that Trump said. He could barely say George Floyd's name, and all he could talk about was domination. And this was very troubling to my 13 or 14-year-old who, it's like they just want someone to tell them that we have work to do, but we can do it together, but that's just like the opposite of what, and we also, we have friends, and we ourselves go and participate sometimes in peaceful protests. And so they're really scared. I wanted to go yesterday downtown Louisville, and there's just a lot of fear in my family about what that would look like, especially because Trump has been insisting to the governors, that they'll look like jerks and fools if they don't utterly dominate. Luckily for us, I guess, our governor hasn't been totally susceptible to that encouragement in Kentucky. But that being said, the National Guard did come in, and a Black man was killed on Sunday night. So we, though, after the call with the governors, our governor actually did decide to dial things back. And so the National Guard presence is being reduced. And I've noticed that the police are just not engaging anymore either. So anyway, yeah, it's troubling. I got a lot of people, in Canada especially, calling me and saying, what's going on down there, right? And especially because Breonna Taylor, her story is very close to home. So yeah, it feels strange. There's lots of helicopters and stuff like that you just don't normally. I mean, this is not DC where these kind of unnamed or unspecified militaristic security forces are apparently being deployed in the last couple of days, and they won't indicate to anyone who they belong to and that sort of thing. We're not quite having that here, but it definitely feels like a scary moment. So yeah.
It's been a weird week in that it's been this week of it's kind of of dualism, right? There are like these two senses that I get, and it's easy to focus on the really pessimistic side of it because and I think that's what I spent most of the week focusing on, right? To watch this kind of spill out and to watch Trump's response and the police response. I mean, you were talking about like the governor sort of not going down that road in Kentucky. There's lots of research on protests and on how to handle protests and de-escalation. It works, right? Escalation rarely works. So when all the police, there were really interesting contrasts. Some places where the police didn't escalate, and others where from the start they're out there in their riot gear. Like some of the videos that went around this week. I mean, if the police wanted to craft a response to confirm the premise of the protests, in many places it would have been hard for them to do a better job of that, right? Some of the stuff that they did just absolutely fulfilled it, but you see the contrast in other places. So that's depressing. I mean, we'll talk about Trump here in a little bit. His rhetoric and how he's responding is depressing. But in other ways, like you see these protests, and I was just down in downtown Keene, which is not a big town, but there was this huge this big rally there. And in other ways, you see, like I don't want to in any way insinuate that like we've succeeded because we have so far to go on this topic. But the difference in the look of that protest and what you see on TV today versus 10 years ago versus 50 years ago, right? When you get back into the civil rights movement, it looks different. Like it's young, it's diverse, it's not just Black people that are out there protesting, and so it feels like the message is in some way getting through, and you see that in the polling numbers that have been out. Trump's approval rating, when asked specifically about his handling of this issue, is pretty abysmal, right? I think it's kind of a widespread thing.
Well, the other, I guess, difference that is really now evident is the protests that the lockdown opponents were waging on state capitals just a couple of weeks ago. And in Kentucky, Governor Beshear has been very proactive, very strategic, very following the CDC, and he's a Democrat, and but it's Kentucky, right? So he's a Kentucky Democrat, and so he's always making sure he says this is actually what the White House officially wants us to be doing and stuff too. Not really what Trump wants, but he's been doing all that stuff, and for a lot of Kentuckians, he was a source of comfort during the quarantine period, and yet there were also these really, violent, violent in the sense of they actually hung him in effigy from a tree out on the Capitol lawn, and they were screaming while he was doing his daily briefings and holding AR-15s and screaming in the face of the Capitol Police and stuff. And in that case, the governor would just be like, well, we got to respect these people's right to I sure hope they're social distancing, but, you can hear them in the background and they're protesting, and that's an important right, and blah, 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 right? And I mean, there was no talk of National Guard or of any kind of any use of force. I mean, the photographs that we saw, the police were just standing there completely stoic. And these people are screaming right in their faces, right? Without face masks. And I just thought, wow. And here you have one thing, and it's like cops in combat gear immediately, despite the fact that I know some of my colleagues are actually also ordained clergy, and so they've been doing participating in these demonstrations as clergy, kind of a religious response to systemic racism. And so I trust their accounts of what's going on, and it was much more peaceful, much more conciliatory to start right before the cops started acting than any of those protests about the COVID quarantine measures. So But you know, all those people were white. So anyway, it's just like just to have them so close back to back, it's just undeniable.
It feels, I mean, this feels to me like I was trying to find like, it does feel like, I don't want to be sensationalist. There have been, you know, news stories that have kind of spun this as like this kind of breaking point or this point of crisis. And it does feel like the most significant point in my lifetime. I was trying to think of like when were things this tense in America prior to this? And I mean, there've been crises in my lifetime, but not like this sort of divisive kind of crisis. And I don't know if it's the civil rights movement. I don't know if it goes back to Great Depression. Bill, Nick, how do you kind of make sense of all of this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you can not only, I think you're right. It's hard to think back. I mean, you go back to 1968. I think that's obviously an important time as well. But I don't know if that was as global as this. Yeah. So we've seen, I mean, you know, if you've watched the footage from around the world, people are showing up and protesting. And that's kind of stunning, right? That the idea that this movement is not just in the United States, it is having a global effect. And that, again, that is stunning. So when you think about all the bad news that's played out this week, and there's been a lot of ugliness, there is a lot of hope that this could change the conversation. Again, and you want it to be more than just a conversation, right? You want real, tangible steps. Yeah, I think for me, one of the more stunning things was the statement that George W. Bush released yesterday. It was, Justin, to go back to your point, it was such a contrast to Trump. And you kind of realize that this is not in Trump's skill set. He doesn't have the ability to handle a moment like this, right? It's just not what he does well. He's good at divisive stuff. He's good at, you know, playing off anger, but he's not good at pulling people together. And man, George W. Bush, just in reading that statement, was. And I know as we tape right now, Barack Obama is giving a statement. I'll be curious to see what he says there. But that longing for somebody to be able to say the right thing, to talk about listening, and it was really, I mean, I guess that I'm no big fan of George W. Bush, but I certainly was of that statement yesterday. Mm-hmm. Nick, why don't you hop in?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I'm gonna be in pretty fundamental opposition to a lot of things that are gonna be said today. So I agree. I think the makeup of this and this situation is fundamentally different from anything that we've seen previously in a really good, positive way. There's just a huge swath of the country that would have never gotten involved in any of this. And even 5 years ago, to go up fundamentally against instances of police brutality in any capacity, this is a seminal moment that I realistically never thought that I would see in my lifetime. And yeah, most of the protests, at least through, you know, the early stages and up until, you know, things tend to get violent later on, they're really positive and go in a good direction. And I think there's a good conversation being had. Having said that, I'll just give you my personal experience from the past few days. So like I mentioned, my fiance is a pediatric oncology nurse who works at one of the hospitals in downtown Chicago. So, you know, the epitome of white privilege. She was working on Saturday as the protests were going on, was getting ready to go home, was blocked in by protesters, harassed by protesters, had to duck into her friend's apartment in downtown Chicago, was forced to stay there overnight as every single building, all the windows were broken, everything was tagged, setting fire to buildings literally on every single corner around her, setting fire to a CVS across the street that had apartments one floor above it, to the point and it was all night. You know, the media made it sound like it was over in a couple of hours. It was 13 hours straight of sitting there, not being able to do anything, wondering if people were going to break further into the apartment building, because they did actually get in at one point. And then worrying that her car was going to get torched overnight, which thank God it didn't, but plenty of cars around hers did. And then you come home and then you have a protest out in Naperville, which has never ever happened. It's considered the wealthiest suburb in the Midwest. Nothing like that has ever happened. And realistically, the vast majority of it throughout the day was positive. Cops were supportive of it, were escorting the protesters. Everything was going good. And then as soon as it started getting dark, people start throwing frozen water bottles at cops, yelling, "Fuck the police." ACAB, which I didn't realize was all cops are bastards, and these are the most privileged white kids you will ever meet in your fucking life. Sitting in the middle of the street, fine, you do that. And then all of a sudden, somebody lobs a friggin' mortar into a group of cops just standing there, not doing anything, not harassing anybody. Nobody had been touched the entire night. And then everybody scatters to the wind, windows start breaking all over the town, like dozens of businesses. And it went on like that. I watched the entire live feed. It was for over 4 hours of people just going in and looting, police not touching anybody, trying to cordon off different sections of the city just to kind of move people out. There was no aggressive behavior whatsoever. And now I hear that they're planning another demonstration for this weekend. And the cops are supportive of that too, saying you can say whatever you want, you can put whatever you want on signs, just don't break any laws. Fine. But this is the thing. Like, I get it, man. And I'm still in 100% support of this movement. Like I said, this is a conversation that needed to happen and should be happening right now. But it's morphed into something else. When you have cities across the country just engulfed in looting and rioting in broad daylight, where New York refuses to bring in the National Guard, when it's days upon days where people are getting shot and stabbed and run over. Not only cops, but protesters too, by other protesters, people defending their businesses. That is unconscionable. It's ridiculous. And nobody is like, again, the conversation needs to keep happening, but this is something different, and something does need to be done about it. And you can say that you support the movement and you don't support rioting and looting of businesses, especially in a place like this. This place just opened all of 4 days ago after COVID, and now every business in this town is completely boarded up for an indeterminate amount of time. They completely destroyed a 30-year-old Thai food restaurant, the epitome of a small business, probably the worst hit one in the town. And you can talk about all the chains and all that. They have insurance and it's property damage. These are people that have lost 90% of their business over the past 3 months, especially immigrant families and people who work at these businesses. And you're going to say that it's just property damage. This is different. In conjunction with what's happened over the past 3 months, people are furious out here. And in every major city where, again, the immigrant businesses that don't have good insurance, who don't have the ability to claw their way back out of COVID and now riots, they're going to have to try and deal with this. That's complete and utter bullshit. And yeah, I don't like the president's response. But again, like we talked about the past few weeks, he is not the be-all, end-all of what is done and what the response should be. And you know what the most positive responses have been across the country? It's been from law enforcement getting together with protesters and groups of people saying, we support you, outside of New York and Los Angeles and Chicago. People saying, you're part of our community. You know, this is a major problem that needs to be taken care of, and we support your right to have this moment, and we want to be part of it too. And nobody seems to talk about that. It's just the stories constantly about cops are pieces of shit while they're getting run ragged across major cities across the country, and nobody gives a shit about them. I've got a family friend who's been a cop for 2 decades, who served in Afghanistan, and he goes, it was bad over there. This is maybe the worst week I've had in my life, and all I've done is try and help these people. Not help, minority groups, but help my community. Not, again, not trying to turn it into a racial thing. And he said, I want to forget this week ever happened. And he was in Afghanistan for over a year. That's a fucking problem.
It is. So Nick and I both live in Naperville, and that has been something where, I mean, you feel like oftentimes these hit in urban areas. It's separate from a white affluent. Naperville is white. It's affluent. It's, it's about a suburb as you can get. And when you drive downtown Naperville right now, all of the businesses, all of them are boarded up. It's such a surreal experience. I think it speaks to the degree to which this is fundamentally different, where this is not simply occurring in urban neighborhoods. This is spreading all over the place. And I think you're right, Nick, that there's room to have a conversation about who's engaging in violence, what is the nature of that, right? That's all important as well, and we can't just look the other way. But it is stunning to see the way in which this is filtering out beyond just the cities.
And we want people have a tendency to want to simplify this into like a black and white thing, and I totally understand your frustration, Nick, but it's also the same sense, which is to say that you're able to distinguish between, you know, the shitty cops and the cops who are out there trying to do the right thing. We have to do that. We also have to do that with the protesters and recognize that, yeah, there are assholes out there who are, you know, looting and doing whatever, but they're not the majority of the protesters. And I've struggled with this, right? Because it's hard. Like the idea of resorting to violence and property destruction doesn't sit well with me. But I also try to think about, like, if I were a black man and had spent my whole life basically protesting peacefully, and not a damn thing has happened. Like, there have been times where, like, I get to a level of frustration where the anger like spills over in a way that's like disproportionate to the particular instance that I'm dealing with. And I think about that in a way in which, like, you know, every other thing, like the one thing that actually gets attention is property destruction. People go out and march in the streets peacefully, and everybody, you know, it feels comfortable with it. You break in a window, and all of a sudden, everybody gives a shit. And so, I don't know how to deal with that nuance, right? Like, I don't like the idea that is happening. The victims of that are innocent victims, oftentimes in neighborhoods that are, you know, oftentimes, you know, blacked out. You know, they're majority minority neighborhoods, and so it's a terrible turn of events. But I also, like, I don't know, I can also understand why it gets to that point, like where I was at the protest today in Keene, and a guy showed up with a Trump flag, and there aren't, you know, Keene is not a diverse town, and the guy with a Trump flag, you know, ran in circles around the protest, and people yelled at him. But there were a couple of black guys who clearly wanted to beat the shit out of the guy, and other people had to hold him back. And I sort of empathize with that, right? Like, if this had been what I'd been experiencing, like, I'd want to do something violent. And so I try to, I don't know how to make sense of that other than to recognize that nothing in this is simple.
Here's the thing.
It's super.
Go ahead, Justin.
Oh, well, I was just going to say it's really complicated, and you know, like, there's a number of different issues involved. So in Louisville, we've had issues where Black Lives Matter activists have actually been asking, especially white so-called allies, to stop breaking windows and to stop rioting, because it's almost like this recreational activity, like this fun kind of like catharsis, right? That Black people know this puts me in more danger, right? So don't be doing this. So there's that aspect. There's also the aspect of just that when people are so upset and they do experience this anguish that is never heard by the system, and also they're not trained. Like we forget that the most effective demonstrations, and often the leaders of these movements, they know this, they train for nonviolent activism, right? You have to practice it. You have to, like, actually get into the habit. It doesn't come natural to us. And so right now what we're seeing is a volcanic, you know, surge of this pain that also will be destructive sometimes, because it is uneducated. Like, it's not that it's uneducated. It's you know, it's not refined. It's not any of that stuff. It's not practiced, right? And so, yeah, there are, you know, from in Louisville, what I'm trying to do is listen to the people that are that do this. But I'm also listening to people like, you know, there's one of the pastors at a predominantly Black church downtown Louisville. A person said, very similarly to your complaint, Nick, actually, right? Here are these businesses, and some of the protests actually have been intentionally moved to the east end of Louisville, which is predominantly white. We have what's called the 9th Street divide. And so on the west side of 9th Street, I mean, it's, you know, the formerly redlined area of town, and it's totally economically depressed, and all that stuff that happens in segregated cities. And so anyway, this Black pastor says, I know, yeah, it's not the right method, right, to bring about change. And now you have your businesses boarded up. But I want you to take a drive through the west end of Louisville, and you'll discover that all the businesses are boarded up. They've been boarded up for 35 years, some of them, right? This is a place that, and he calls it plantation capitalism, has forgotten. So kind of like, don't give me this shit, right? Oh no, this is the first time that you've really had to reckon with, in a material way, right? The damage that the system wreaks on human life. So he's like, I'm not recommending it, right? I'm not but I am saying this now gives you a window into, all of a sudden it feels a little bit like you live maybe in the West End. That's where we live all the time. That's where we live constantly. That's our reality. And guess what? Nobody in St. Matthews, nobody in like these kind of more affluent suburbs of Louisville that are overwhelmingly white, they don't care about that, right? They might read a book about it, but when it comes to voting for their city councilor, that sort of thing, I mean, that's not the message that they're listening to, right? So I don't know. There's all those issues. I totally agree. I mean, I personally, I think I'm with Phil too. I get why it might happen. I also think that sometimes it's happening on the part of people that aren't actually the real primary sufferers of the pain, right? And so that's awful, yeah, and that's horrible. Yeah. And anyway, but then there's this other stuff of like, well, when will we be heard? And I think that's a fair question. It's one I can't necessarily, at least not as if I know that pain. Yeah. So yeah.
Realistically, I understand that there's going to be violence in this situation. Like you would be completely unrealistic to think that there's not. My issue is, again, going back to what happened here. So the majority of the protests, again, completely peaceful. When it did get out of hand, again, there were 2 solid hours of just walking around the town, seeing who was looting what. The vast majority were black kids under the age of probably 25 who realistically were not part of the original protest, who were there to be opportunistic, to antagonize. And I'm not saying that they were, again, not part of the original group. But at some point, this continues to go on, and nothing, it affects the movement. It affects the message, where it may not be the people, the primary people who are trying to get their message across. But as time goes on, days now, a solid week of this going on, you lose the efficacy and the potentness of the message you're trying to put out there. So at some point, you have to push back against that. Killer Mike talking in Atlanta about, you know, don't destroy your own community. I get that you're mad. What you need to do is plot and figure out how you're going to change this at a political level to change the system to make it benefit you, and that the system is wrong for putting you in this position, but the best thing that you can do is strategize how you're going to change this politically. And that's a powerful thing to say from someone who's still going, I'm mad as hell, and I completely get it, and I want to go out there and throw a brick at somebody or a building or set something on fire, but that's not going to solve this problem. And you see it here already. People in Naperville going up to businesses that had their windows broken, that are boarded up, tearing off BLM signs because they are mad as shit. And you're starting to militarize people who would not otherwise be militarized because they think they've been wrong. Their businesses have been shut down. They've been harassed in their own town, which they never ever thought would happen. And you can talk about the difference in the wealth gap and everything else that's evolved in this discussion. That doesn't matter. You want to talk about the president. The fundamental thing that all of us should be aware of, and that is core to the discussions that we have, is, at least from my perspective, is that all politics is local, is it not? And then when this shit happens, whatever the president is saying, people are going to care about when their businesses are closed, when they've been harassed, when something happens to affect their lives. And the more and more time goes on where that does happen, this is going to fundamentally shift the conversation into something other than what was originally intended.
Well, and if it plays out too long, so if the, and I tend to think that the violence is likely to ebb over the next few days, but the protests are going to continue. If it doesn't play out that way, this does play into Trump's hand, right? I mean, what he is craving is continued violence, continued looting, because then he can continue to run with this law and order theme. I mean, Phil, this is classic comparative politics, right? This is when you've got a protest movement and you've got a nonviolent movement. What the repressive regime wants is one tiny act of violence because it enables them to then crush. So I mean, it's a really delicate balance. But to Justin's point, it's so hard to have these organic movements bubble up and try to say something and do it always in a perfect way. It doesn't happen like that, especially in a world when you've got agitators on both the left and the right who are benefiting from increased agitation, right? I mean, you've got, again, whether it's Antifa or whether it's right-wing nationalist groups, certainly they benefit from further destruction and violence.
Like, how about that? So, what is it? What do you think about those elements? Do you? I mean, I know my particular perspective just because I have direct evidence of it, but those elements, so Antifa and other elements within not this movement, but have attached themselves to this movement to be opportunistic. This is like the crux of my whole thing with this argument is whatever the discussion that we're having right now. I think that the media coverage of it has been reprehensible in the way that they've approached it, and I'll certainly go into detail about that later on. But again, based on evidence that I've seen and that people have fed me, especially from downtown Chicago, when people talk about those pallets of bricks showing up, that's a real fucking thing. Like, there is some organized element that is trying to exacerbate this problem, and is like in an exceptionally robust and widespread way that I have never really seen in any other situation. Again, talking about what my fiance witnessed, somebody pulled up right below their building with a flatbed truck full of 2x4s. Like, we had pictures of it, and people just start taking it out and just smashing windows left and right. Like, I mean, going back to my not original point, but previous point, that this is giving these people more time to change the narrative of this, and that's scary to me, because I don't know. Like, what are your thoughts on those elements and what it's doing to this?
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think that people are looking to capitalize on this, or to, you know, anytime there's some sort of opportunity, there are going to be people who try to take advantage of that opportunity. My tendency is to think that they are. It's not that those don't exist. It's that if we can get so bogged down in talking about those elements, or there's so many aspects to this that it's easy to miss the forest for the trees. And for me, like, I don't want to deny all of that's happening, but it seems like there's one really big story, which is this like massive outpouring. Like, it's now all 50 states and like 40 countries worldwide. It's now like, I saw somebody pointing out, it's the largest mass demonstration in history now because of this. So there's this really big message, and it's not that those side stories don't matter or aren't important, but I don't want to miss the bigger story because of those things. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which is in some ways saying I don't want to take their bait, right? So there are these groups that are doing this sort of stuff, and I don't want to deny that that's happening. But I also, how we deny them their victory is to not lose our focus on the bigger story that's going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, none of the people that I've been out with and that I've been following who are organizing demonstrations are, I mean, they're anti-fascists for sure, but like, they're not this nebulous Antifa. Whatever that means, right? So they're not organizing, trucks to damage things on purpose and stuff. They're actually people that they do a lot of reading about. They're kind of maybe as like they read Saul Alinsky, right? And so yeah, sure, that's radical, but it's strategic. I mean, it has like a purpose in mind, and it's always about using the energy of the system in a way that you can actually get to the result that you intend. And then, you know, the rest of the people that come out are just like people that are sick and tired of their friends being, you know, feeling like they should be feared. So that's like, to me, that's all that I've really experienced. Now, I've watched the news and stuff, and so I know that there's other things going on, but I think I agree with Phil that it would be problematic for just even like for this moment of reckoning. That would be like that's a different thing to reckon with, and it's a much smaller, as far as morally speaking, for a society as a whole, it's a much smaller thing to me, right? So thinking about the biases of the criminal justice system is the opportunity right now, and is the important one that we should seize. Not necessarily thinking about like, does the left or the right infiltrate most effectively, or who's more dangerous or whatever. Like that's I just feel like overall, right, globally speaking, it's a small piece of I think it's totally interesting and important to think about, but it's just not as important as the big stuff. Yeah.
I will say if the violent elements continue, it becomes harder. It will tear away from the other narrative, right? It will make it more difficult to have this more meaningful conversation, right? And it will feed into, I mean, you're already seeing Trump calling these groups terrorists, right? Which is, again, we could spend a whole episode just talking about that label. You had Bill Barr coming out and saying that this was Antifa before we really know that, right? I mean, I think the reality is these groups that are engaging in this violence have multiple different motivations. Some, to Nick's point, are just looking to loot. Others have political motivations. Others are looking to just burn the whole place down. So, you know, for me, that was too early to be pointing fingers like that, to say this is terrorism. You know, this is driven by a left wing. So it's, you know, we're going to need more time to really understand who those groups were and what their motivations ultimately were. Should we we got a lot more to talk about, but should we take a quick break and talk beer and then come back?
Sure. Yeah. Before we do that, so this is like the point. This is the reason we do this podcast, right? Like, Nick, you're having to put up with 3, you know, academics who don't agree with you, and you're expressing, and like, this is a hard conversation, right? And this is what we should be doing. And you know, I'm glad we're doing it. Like, you know, we are 4 white guys, but still, like, I'm glad we're having this conversation.
Yeah, totally. I mean,
I'm glad that you're
totally. All of you can fuck off, but yeah, no, true, absolutely, yeah.
Oh well, Justin, you're not having a beer. Why don't you tell us about the bourbon you're enjoying?
So I'm actually
a whole bottle.
Well, I finished this bottle, so I just thought I'd bring it in here. It's Rabbit Hole Distillery, and it's actually based here in Louisville, and it's a 4-grain small batch bourbon, and is really smooth without being overly sweet, which is one of my pet peeves about bourbon. And so yeah, haven't been drinking a lot of beer lately, so I'm enjoying this a lot. And yeah, it also just felt like, hey, you're having a Kentucky guest, I might as well pour some bourbon. So.
Well done. Yeah. Phil, how about you?
So I said last week that I went to the local brewery, the Branch and Blade here in Keene, and got a few beers last week. I'm having another one of theirs. It's called Clickbait, which is kind of a nice name for a beer. There's the can. And it is I should have looked up more about it. It's a Helles beer. It's basically a light, you know, lager-like beer. It is, you know, it's a great summer beer. It's not, you know, nothing overpowering in the flavor, but it's really nice, right? If you want a light beer, a lightish beer that's just kind of refreshing, it hits the spot. It's not like, you know, particularly subtle or nuanced, but it's pretty tasty.
Nice. Nicholas?
I wasn't able to go anywhere just because I was seething in anger for the past several days, but I did have something in the fridge. I had a punk lemonade, which this is from the guys who make that the mead that we like.
Yeah.
I just kind of randomly came across it. So this is a hard cider with raspberry and lemon. Tom would punch me in the face for having this, but yeah, like it's. Yeah, it's really good. Like you imagine something like this to come out looking like neon pink or something, and to be exceptionally sweet. It's a really like nice light cider that isn't overly effervescent. Yeah, highly recommend. I haven't had anything bad from these guys yet. So Bee Nectar, check them out.
All right, sounds good. I'm having a Summertime, which is from Goose Island. It is their German style Kolsch, and It's really good. A few weeks back, Phil, you were talking about how Pilsners have done like really good things, and this feels like that as well, where it's, there used to be just those standard bland summer beers, but this is really, it's got a little bit of a fruitiness to it. It's very crisp. It's, it's got a good aroma. I am very pleased with where Pilsners and Kolsch beers have gone.
You said it's Goose Island? Is that what you said?
Goose Island, which, they're, big Chicago brewery. And,
I always come across, like these sort of micro looking beers from these big breweries, and I always am I'm hesitant. I'm always gun shy, but I know that they do make good stuff. I should actually try some of those every now and then.
Yeah, Goose Island, when they first came out, I loved them. I'm not as sold on their stuff, but this was really good from them. All right, so we're Nick, you want to do the
find us on Untapped.
All right, we're not going to do speed round. We're just going to do another 30 minutes talking about another big topic relating to the week's event. So on Monday evening, federal authorities used tear gas. Well, we could debate tear gas, but
we can.
To clear Lafayette,
gas that causes tears.
That's right.
It's not technically tear gas. It's just gas that makes people cry.
Pepper spray, yeah. To clear Lafayette Square so President Trump could pose for a photo while holding a Bible in front of St. John's Episcopal Church. While the crowd was being, quote, dispersed, Trump delivered a speech in the Rose Garden declaring himself, quote, your president of law and order, and scolding the country's governors for not being tough enough. The photo session lasted for about 15 minutes and involved a truly bizarre photo of Trump awkwardly displaying a Bible. It was as if the guy had never held a Bible before, or he thought it was going to start on fire. He was accompanied by a group of aides, including Attorney General Bill Barr, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, as well as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, U.S. Army General Mark Milley. So much to break down here, including Trump's use of religion, the idea of Trump as your president of law and order, and the blurring of the civilian-military divide. Justin, given that this is your second appearance on the podcast, you are now officially our senior theological analyst. So what did you make of the administration's use of religion in the midst of this crisis?
That was a really strange moment. And now I guess was it Mark Esper? He basically said, like, I didn't know where we were going, right? Like, I didn't know this was going to happen. I'm embarrassed. There's a lot of embarrassment among even top White House officials over this thing. But I think that there are a lot of people that probably enjoyed Trump's, I guess it was an assertion of a kind of like divine mandate. The funny part about it is, of course, that he doesn't seem to have read the Bible and, all that stuff, right? So his own personal religiousness is not really, for him, it's not relevant. And because he knows that it's politically powerful to symbolize religiousness. So even if the symbol is empty, and there are a lot of people in the United States, and his support among evangelicals remains pretty strong. So what I thought when what was he doing here? I basically just thought this is one of those very common throughout history gestures on the part of a leader to give his sovereignty a kind of higher authorization. And so, he didn't care. Somebody asked him outright, is that your Bible? And he goes, it's a Bible, right? Like, he's like, it's a Bible, right? I'm doing this, this is the picture, right? And here I am holding it very awkwardly. But it's a Bible, so whatever, who cares if it's mine? And that's a very interesting, it was very interesting because it's also very characteristically American in terms of the religious right in America in the last, kind of since the moral majority movement in the late 70s and into the 80s. And basically what it is it's a way of thinking about religiousness that doesn't allow for religion actually to transcend the nation state. So the sovereignty of the nation state and the authority of God become completely collapsed into one another. And what that does is it enables, it basically, it prevents religion from ever having a critical lens to offer on the status quo. So God becomes a completely in-house reality, right? Totally accessible, perfectly accessible to those in power, and utterly incapable, too feeble to ever offer a critique. So that's like a weird, and again, historically speaking, it's a pretty specifically thing. I mean, it's one reason why Pope Francis, you know, from a Catholic standpoint, is a controversial figure for American Catholics, is because American Catholics, they are very suspicious. And in part, this is because, you know, they have a long history of being persecuted in this country, right? This is a very Protestant country. And so, you know, I remember when like Jeb Bush was running for president, right? And of course he's Catholic, and Ann Coulter was like, this guy's gonna listen to the Pope, right? He won't listen to the American. But that's an interesting thing about the Catholic Church, and I'm not Roman Catholic myself, but about the Catholic Church is that it actually represents the fact that divine authority is above the authority of worldly rulers by the fact that it has its own separate state. Right? There is this other place that is actually more authoritative. And so then Jeb Bush was in this awkward position of saying, I'm not going to listen to the Pope. You know, how dare you? Right? I'll listen to the, which then a lot of American Catholics were like, really? Like, are you going to, a little bit? Like, shouldn't you kind of listen to the Pope if you're Catholic? So there's this awkward, we're very suspicious in the United States of people who actually believe that God's authority transcends the sovereignty of the nation state. And Trump knows that. And so he made use of that fact, that suspicion, by doing this photo op. And because, you know, it's really funny, like, and the fact that it came right after his insistence on order. And I think actually, maybe when I was with you guys the first time establishing my credentials as a theological analyst, I think we might have been talking about like, were we talking about immigration and
Canadian
Jeff
immigration,
Sessions and stuff? And yeah. Okay. So, I mean, so when Jeff Sessions was Attorney General, he was making this claim about actually a similar kind of claim to what Trump is now asserting with the Bible thing, which is he was interpreting a passage from Romans 13, where he basically was like, yeah, doesn't it say here you're just supposed to obey anything that any earthly authority ever says, right? So you have to do that, and I'm sorry. And if you're a child, that still holds for you, and so you should be separated from your family or whatever. So there's a similar kind of theological move that's going on here. And what's interesting about the law and order thing is that if you look at the Bible, I mean, I don't want to get overly theological with you guys, but if you look at the Bible, like God is not a fan of order for order's sake at all. In fact, a lot of the time it's you know, it's God dismantling order. I mean, what I think of as the founding story of the biblical narrative as a whole is the story of the Exodus. And the story of the Exodus is a story of Moses basically coming to a ruler and saying, hey, you know, those people who like you think don't count? Well, God, actually, the creator of the universe says that they do count. They matter. They're important. Their lives matter. And Pharaoh is like, F you, how dare you? You think you speak for God? Like, look at me up here, right? I've got to look at my palace. Have you seen my palace? You can't possibly imagine that you speak for God. How dare you? And in fact, let me show you God's power. And I think there's something, I mean, this is a historically repeated pattern of people in power seeking this kind of authorization. But anyway, God demonstrates that God is totally indifferent to the hierarchies that humans set up. That's one of the main themes of the Bible. You know, and then it comes back in the New Testament too, where Jesus is kind of recapitulating Moses's ethic. And the prophets after Moses in the Hebrew Bible are also recapitulating this ethic. Essentially for the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible. Again, I'll stop talking so much about the Bible, but in a second. But for the Israelites, they keep on being reminded by their own prophets that, remember, God is the God who brought you out of Egypt. That's who God is. Remember that. You're forgetting that because now there are oppressed people in your midst. And so you've forgotten that you don't know who God is. God is the God who brought you out of Egypt, which means that this God is perfectly willing to dismantle any human system that you've set. You can't ever come to God, in other words, and say, I know there's injustice and like it's hard and there's a wealth gap and stuff, but like GDP, right? Like it's up, like the stock market, you know, the Dow Jones. God does not give a shit about that in the Bible. So that's the kind of thing that's going on right now in American Christianity. So I'm not even just talking about the electorate or like the political thing, is that there's this interesting moment, and I think it was captured nicely by the photo op and then the bishop's response to it. And even actually the Catholic Bishop of Washington, D.C. issued a very strong statement against Trump's visit to a Catholic shrine for John Paul II, where you're having this moment of basically American Christians having to have this kind of conversation about, am I Christian first or American first, or what? How does my patriotism, how does my fidelity to the sovereignty of the nation state relate to my supposed and like, you know, to my bumper sticker that says Jesus, right? And I think people are kind of starting to recognize that those may sometimes be in tension, and you may have to be, as a result of your Christian commitments, you may have to be deeply skeptical and even critical, and you know, willing to deconstruct the status quo of the nation state. And that's not something that we're used to doing. And you know, when I ask my students, like sometimes I'll say, like, okay, so just imagine, right? Like I teach this course on religion and environmental ethics. I also teach a course on religion and war. I said, just imagine I tell you, I'm going to invite my friend into the room in a second. He's going to come into the classroom, and his name is John, and he is super Christian. Okay. And then I just asked them to write down, what are your assumptions that you just made about John? Right. And none of their assumptions that they just made about John is, oh, John loves God so much that he's perfectly willing to be a nonconformist to the nation state, that he is probably a super hardcore environment because he loves creation. He loves God's creation. And so he's going to, or that because he loves God and God is the creator of all persons and all things visible and invisible, that he is not going to be for war in any circumstance. They never say that, right? Because in America, we make an assumption that to be super Christian and to be basically in lockstep with whatever the powers that be say is necessary is automatic. That connection. So anyway, I was thinking just a little bit about Martin Luther King Jr. because I just taught this book, Strength to Love, in a class, and he's got this chapter in this book that's called Transformed Nonconformist. And he interprets this passage. Actually, it's right around the passage that Jeff Sessions was quoting and using to like get everybody to be in lockstep with the administration on immigration, at least if they're a Christian. And it says, "Be not conformed to this world." And anyway, you know, King just riffs on this and says that nobody in history has been a more dedicated nonconformist than Jesus. And he doesn't mean by that an anarchist, right? That like a purposeless nonconformist, like a person who just says no matter what, right? But he calls it a transformed nonconformist, someone who actually thinks about justice, even if it costs you friends in the status quo, or position in the status quo, or authority, or benefits. So you have that, and actually that is really captured in the Black church tradition at large in general in this country, where the Black church tradition is what theologians would call a prophetic branch of Christianity. That is, the prophets in the Bible are always the ones who are going like, you bunch of shitheads claim that you love God, but you've never cared about an orphan, a widow, or a stranger in your life. And so that's bullshit. And then the people ostracize them and send them into exile or kill them, right? And I think that the Black church theology is really that prophetic voice, and has been that prophetic voice even since the era of chattel slavery in this country, right up until the present moment. And so I think Trump asserting this idea of like, me and God, we are totally in cahoots, is him going, there is no possibility of prophetic critique of this regime, right? If you invoke God, you have to be with me.
That's a long tradition in the U.S. On both sides of there's lots of writing about American civil religion, right? And that politicians use this reference to God, and we like to think of God as this, or as America as this godly country, without ever getting into the details, right? We can harken back to this, and that's every president does that. It's just that the contrast is so stark with Trump, and it feels like I don't know if that's a debate that's already going on, or if it's the contrast that Trump brings out that's sort of helping to foster that debate. But it was interesting to see the Well, really, I mean, within the church, all sorts of division in terms of, you know, a number of people who are incredibly pissed off and others who ate it up, right? Because it is this idea of I'm a godly person and God's on my side. Yeah, the Law and Order thing is an old. This is not a new photo op. It's just a particularly awkward one.
But it's the authenticity of it, right? I mean, that's what's kind of stunning to me. I get the argument of you know, faith and you know, being blessed from on high, but Trump is so awkward at presenting that message, right? I mean, their previous president, George W. Bush, who was very, very good at that and connected with the evangelical community. I'm surprised, right? I know there's been criticism, but not from the evangelical community for this. They're eating this up, right? I mean, he stands up there with this book, right? And it's, you know, he doesn't know how to hold it. And it just, I was really surprised that they thought that was a good idea, that either Ivanka or whoever it was, Hope Hicks, thought this would be a good idea. Because I see this being one of the moments that will stick in history. People will remember that walkover. They will remember being, you know, not necessarily, I think it is tear gassing, but I mean, pepper spray, all of that. This is going to be a mark on Trump's legacy.
I think this will be gone in a week.
No, yeah, Nick, you think so?
100%. So, like any good Catholic, I haven't read the Bible, but yeah, no, that's those are exceptionally interesting points, and I'd actually like to talk to you more about that, Justin, if we have time. But to me, this is. You know, what he did was, yeah, like you said, it was awkward. It was weird. It didn't make any appreciable sense. And it wasn't getting a genuine point across. Having said that, what fucking world have you been living in for the past 3 years? You know exactly why this is happening, and everybody else knows exactly why this was happening and has their own spin to it. We can talk about confirmation bias and bias versus agenda the same way that and I 100% believe this, that the corporate media is agenda driven. It can equally be said of evangelical Christians at this point, because this is not about religion. This is about your particular position in the country.
About power.
Yeah, to some extent, it's about power and place, and you know, you have your avatar to get your point across, the same way that the left has their avatars to get the point across.
So
these are vessels for a message. Religion.
He doesn't even have to believe in any of this. All he has to do is hold. It's like holding up a chip.
None of them believe in everything. Do you think Obama believed in hope and change while he was droning every next fucking brown kid in the Middle East and Asia? Are you insane? It's all a bunch of bullshit. No, it's complete and utter horseshit. No, it's. Go ahead, Bell.
The reason I think you're wrong, Nick, is that there have been some who have expressed some shame over this, right? And so you're seeing, to Justin's point, they're seeing some pushback from some religious communities and others who were on that walk, right? You know, Mark Esper and others who get that this is not good, and maybe that's a transition into the civil military divide, but like they now get that this was, you know, didn't want to be in this picture. This is not going to be one where I'm happy, you know, 10 years from now that I was at this moment.
But they don't want to be in that picture after the fact. They were fine marching across the place and standing next to him while they took a picture. Yeah. And it was as everything goes bad that Esper is like, oh, I shouldn't have. I imagine the military. There's an interesting divide in all of this between the police and the military, which I think people in the U.S. oftentimes conflate the two. And we could get into the whole Insurrection Act and stuff like that. But there's even there have been some interesting polls in terms of like support for Trump amongst the military is significantly lower than support for Trump amongst the police. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't be surprised that because of norms and all of these old traditions. I think that Esper and Milley and some of those others really took I think they heard from a lot of people in the military because of these traditions of civil military relations. And Esper didn't seem to know what to do with it today. He walked it back, said he doesn't support using the Insurrection Act, but then later in the day, he had started to call troops away from DC, and he put a halt to that. And he's trying to please so many people, he doesn't know what to do, I don't think.
But I do think his statement today was big, right? It won't get a lot of attention, but that walk back was significant because he had to think about that entire military establishment. And I think you're right, Phil, who was saying this is not who we don't respond to political whims, right? Our job is to be the military and not to police the country. So, I mean, I give him a little bit of credit for making that statement today, which I think he had to if he was going to have any credibility. I think it gets him fired. I wouldn't be surprised, 3 weeks from now if he's gone, and O'Brien, the national security advisor, is our new Secretary of Defense.
I think this. So you think this won't stick around? I tend to think. Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that it's. I've thought this before, but it seems like the contrasts were so over the top in this. The gassing, the dispersal of the crowd to make way for this photo op. It touches on so many things, so many people. If you're in support of the protests, you're pissed off about it. If you're a civil libertarian in support of First Amendment rights, you're pissed off about it, right? That this narcissistic president who's going to launch an attack on peacefully protesting people in order just to get his photo op. If you're
libertarians are highly inconsistent on this point, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're religious, there were people. I still think that. Trump has his base. He has this 35% of people who are going to eat up whatever he does. But I don't know. I think that the symbolism of that moment might be, I think it might stick around. I think like 10 years from now, when we look back on the Trump presidency, that might be one of those moments that kind of exemplifies the tensions of this era.
But I mean, what lens are you looking at it through? Realistically, most of those conversations that are happening, the more not nuanced conversations, but the continuous conversations that are happening aren't happening on mainstream media, because they have more shit than they know what to do with, and they move on to their locusts. They move from one thing to another, and the continuing conversation is happening on social media, where the narrative bends to your will depending on who you're talking to and what people are involved in it, and everybody is presenting their own particular opinion. Truth is subjective, completely and utterly subjective at this point. Not in reality. I'm not saying in reality. I'm saying objective truth in the political sphere that we're talking about right now no longer exists, because everybody has access, and people talk about this all the time. You can't know what's in somebody's head and what they're thinking. I can know exactly what every person is thinking at any moment of the day, because they put it out there every moment of the day. There is nothing that we don't know about what people think. It's everywhere, and they're going to, again, to bend it to meet their needs. It's, again, the difference between bias and agenda, starting with an endpoint and filling in the data as it comes in to meet what your needs. And this will be gone, because there will be something else to go, I have to put my spin on this, whether you're talking about it from the right or the left. And it happens on both sides, whether you think so or not. I think it's this will be a blip on the radar, just like everything else has been a blip on the radar for the past 3 years.
So I largely endorse your cynicism, because I think you're right. People do largely, filter the news that they get. This is, cognitive bias stuff, right? Information screens. We listen to information that lines up with our worldview, and we, cast aside stuff that doesn't. And so I think in general, that's true. But at the margins, people do change their minds, right? Some people do change their minds. And with cognitive bias type stuff, when they do change their minds, or it's when those contrasts are like so overwhelming